Today's world is actually the result of 10 wars. If even one of these wars had ended differently, you might be living a completely different life right now. You don't need to be an expert to open the dusty pages of history. It's enough to understand that war has always been an unchanging shadow of humanity. In this video, we will examine the 10 most important wars that changed the fate of the world forever. One of the greatest empires in history, Rome, was not built in a single day, but its collapse began on the edge of a river, with the cries of a desperate people. In 376 AD, the vast steppes of Eastern Europe were gripped by the terror of the Huns. Thousands of Goths, torn from the lands they had inhabited for centuries, fled from the brutality of the Huns and arrived at the gates of Rome. Emperor Valens saw this wave of refugees as fresh blood that could strengthen his army and opened the gates. However, arrogance and corruption turned this act of humanity into a disaster. Roman officials treated these refugees with cruelty. They even forced starving Goths to sell their own children into slavery in exchange for food. In 377, this humiliation gave way to blind rage. The Goths had finally raised the banners of rebellion. The Battle of Adrianople was the moment Rome's arrogant shield was shattered. Rome, which had been considered an invincible power until that day, marched against the Goths without waiting for reinforcements. But the result of the battle sent shockwaves across the world. Emperor Valens himself died on the battlefield. His successor, Theodosius I, was only able to secure peace by granting the Goths the right to live within Roman lands, under their own laws. This was the beginning of the end. Rome had allowed the barbarians inside, blurring its own borders and identity. After this war, other barbarian tribes gained confidence. Each of them settled within Rome, accelerating Europe's transition into a new demographic structure. The Visigoths formed Spain, the Franks formed France, the Ostrogoths formed Italy, and the Anglo-Saxons formed England. Rome's centralized system gave way to feudalism. Europe entered the Dark Ages. The Church became the most powerful institution. If this war had never happened, perhaps the Western Roman Empire would still be the world's superpower today. This war is on this list not by choice, but by necessity. To understand why there are two different Chinas today and the never-ending chess game between Washington and Beijing, we must go back to 1927. In the dark streets of Shanghai, the massacre of thousands of communists under the orders of nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek ignited the spark of a hatred that would last for decades. Under the leadership of Mao Zedong, the communists embarked on an impossible escape: the Long March. Of the 70,000 people who began this 9,000-kilometer march of death, only 7,000 survived. Just as everything seemed over, history introduced its most unexpected actor, Japan. The Japanese invasion forced Chiang Kai-shek to ally with the communists, his sworn enemies. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Civil War, which seemed extinguished, was reborn from its ashes. With Soviet support behind him, Mao's guerrilla forces swept away the corruption-ridden nationalist army. On October 1, 1949, when Mao stood in Tiananmen Square and declared, "The Chinese people have stood up," the world would never be the same again. The most concrete result of the war was the establishment of the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949. This meant that nearly a quarter of the world's population came under communist rule overnight. The addition of a massive ally alongside the Soviet Union completely shifted the balance of the Cold War. Today, China is the world's largest production hub and the second largest economy. However, this economic power is intertwined with totalitarian structures such as strict state control, technological surveillance, and the suppression of opposition, legacies of the Civil War. The nationalists, who were swept out of China, retreated to present-day Taiwan. Although China claims sovereignty over Taiwan, the Western-backed Taiwan exists today as an independent state. The fact that most of the electronic devices we use today are produced in Taiwan is also rooted in the support of anti-communist states. The conquest of the Americas was not a single-pitched battle. It was the most radical transformation process in history, where technological gaps, biological disasters, and unshakable belief collided. This conquest began in 1492, when Christopher Columbus accidentally set foot in the Americas, and it changed the very genetic structure of an entire continent. When Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of Mexico in 1519 with around 500 soldiers, a few horses, and cannons, he faced a massive empire with millions of subjects, the Aztec Empire. Cortés acted strategically and formed alliances with indigenous tribes that were hostile to the empire. The Aztec Empire could not resist modern weapons, but the most powerful weapon was disease. When Spanish soldiers arrived on the American continent, they also brought diseases such as influenza and smallpox. Nearly 90% of the indigenous population, who had no immunity to these diseases, died without even fighting. Cortés' goal was not only to gain land, but to establish an economic model. Beneath these lands lay more gold and silver than they could ever desire. However, since nearly the entire indigenous population had died from disease, Cortés found the solution in slaves brought from Africa. After this conquest, the Atlantic slave trade began. From the Americas to Europe, the trade of agricultural products such as potatoes, tomatoes, corn, and cacao began. The potato, in particular, due to its high caloric value, led to a population explosion in Europe. If this agricultural exchange had not occurred, perhaps none of us would have been born today. The conquest was not only political, but also ideological. The majority of the indigenous population was eliminated, and their belief systems were suppressed. Christianity became the dominant religion. Before the conquest, hundreds of indigenous languages were spoken across the continent. But after the conquest, these languages were almost erased. If today most of Latin America speaks Spanish, Brazil speaks Portuguese, North America speaks English, and Canada speaks French. The reason is the conquest of the Americas and the colonial system built with people brought from outside. The Punic War was one of the greatest and most decisive confrontations of the ancient world. It was not merely a struggle between two city-states, but a turning point that determined the foundations upon which the Mediterranean, and therefore Western civilization, would be built. The war was triggered when Carthage's legendary general Hannibal Barca laid siege to the city of Saguntum, an ally of Rome. But Hannibal's true plan was unexpected. Hannibal crossed the Alps with his army and war elephants, enduring the harsh winter, and attacked Rome by land. This move is considered one of the greatest logistical achievements in military history. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BC was the peak moment when the Roman army was nearly annihilated, and Hannibal perfected his double envelopment tactic. Despite the shock of Cannae, Rome did not surrender. With the Fabian strategy, they avoided direct confrontation and began to wear Hannibal down. A young Roman general, Scipio Africanus, entered the stage and carried the war into the heart of Carthage, North Africa. Using Hannibal's own tactics against him, Scipio defeated the Carthaginian army. This victory determined the final outcome of the war. The consequences of this war were not just a redistribution of land, but a transformation of the global system. Before the war, Rome was a regional power. After the war, it became the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage's naval power was destroyed, its fleet burned, and Rome transformed into a maritime empire. If Carthage had won, today, a Phoenician-based culture and a Semitic language might dominate Europe and its surroundings. Rome's victory paved the way for the spread of Roman law, the Latin alphabet, and later Christianity across the world through Europe. The 7 Years' War is often referred to by historians as the Zero World War, because this war was fought not only in Europe, but also in America, India, Africa, and across the seas, involving all the global powers of the time. At its core, the war had two main dynamics. The first was the struggle between Britain and France for dominance in North America and India. The second was the rise of Prussia and Austria's desire to reclaim the region of Silesia that it had lost. King Frederick II of Prussia, despite being surrounded on all sides, achieved miraculous victories against massive armies with his military genius. Britain followed the strategy of finance Prussia on the continent, destroy France at sea. By crippling the French navy, it captured Quebec and almost completely erased French influence in India. When the 7 Years' War ended, the world map and political mindset had changed irreversibly. With the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain became the empire on which the sun never sets. France lost almost all of its territories in North America. This marked the beginning of the global dominance of Anglo-Saxon culture and the English language. Britain had won the war, but it was under massive debt. To repay this, it imposed heavy taxes on the American colonies. The colonists' rebellion with the slogan, "No taxation without representation," paved the way for the founding of the United States. France not only lost the war, but also came to the brink of bankruptcy. Economic collapse and loss of prestige shook the people's trust in the monarchy. The financial ruin caused by the 7 Years' War became one of the main triggers of the French Revolution in 1789. Prussia proved itself as one of the greatest military powers in Europe. This success laid the military and political foundation for the future unified German Empire. After the war, France's influence in India was completely broken. This led to the British East India Company taking control of the entire subcontinent, and India becoming the brightest jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Constantine's civil war was a Game of Thrones process that fundamentally transformed not only the political structure of the Roman Empire, but also the religion and cultural fabric of the entire Western world. The Roman Empire had been divided into East and West to make governance easier, with a senior and a junior emperor assigned to each side. However, when Constantius I died in 306 AD, his army declared his son Constantine as emperor. This event destroyed the merit-based tetrarchy system and triggered a series of succession wars. Constantine defeated all his rivals in both the East and the West, and reunified the empire under a single authority after nearly 40 years. His victory redirected the course of history in three major ways. Before the war, Christianity was a persecuted and illegal minority religion in Rome. After Constantine's victory, the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity. With the support of the Roman state, Christianity rapidly became a world religion. If Constantine had lost this war, Europe today might have had a polytheistic pagan belief system, or Christianity might have remained a marginal Middle Eastern sect. For strategic and economic reasons, Constantine moved the center of the empire from Rome to Byzantium, known today as Istanbul. This decision extended the life of the Roman Empire in the East by another 1,000 years. Constantinople became the greatest center of culture, trade, and science throughout the Middle Ages. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the legacy of ancient Greece and Rome was preserved in this city and later fueled the Renaissance. Constantine needed religious unity to hold the empire together and convened the Council of Nicaea in 325. The core doctrine of Christianity and the standardization of the Bible were shaped at this council. This was one of the earliest major examples of the state structuring religious institutions for its own survival, forming the foundation of modern religion-state relations. When the Islamic armies set out, the two superpowers of the time, Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire, were exhausted from centuries of war with each other. Under the command of Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Islamic army defeated Byzantium and opened the gates to Syria and Palestine. With the victories of Qadisiyah and Nihavend, the thousand-year-old Sasanian Empire completely collapsed, and the Iranian plateau came under Muslim control. The wave of conquest did not stop. In 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed Gibraltar, leading to the scoot of the Visigothic kingdom and the Iberian Peninsula coming under Islamic rule. These conquests were not only military successes, but a global civilizational transformation. In antiquity, the Mediterranean had been an internal sea and a trade lake under Roman control. With these conquests, it was divided into two. The south and east became Muslim, while the north remained Christian. This division altered Europe's trade routes and pushed it inward, accelerating its shift toward feudalism. The modern identity of Europe was shaped through its interaction and conflict with Islam. Muslims inherited the scientific and intellectual legacy of Greek, Indian, and Persian knowledge centers, such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Gundishapur. These works were translated into Arabic, initiating the Islamic Golden Age. Centuries later, this knowledge was transmitted to Europe through Andalusia and Sicily, laying the foundations of the Renaissance and modern science. The face of the Middle East and North Africa changed permanently. Languages such as Aramaic, Coptic, and Berber were largely replaced by Arabic, creating the vast cultural bloc known today as the Arab world. From the ashes of World War II, two opposing blocs emerged. On one side, the Western Bloc led by the United States, defending liberalism and capitalism. On the other, the Eastern Bloc led by the Soviet Union, defending communism and a centrally planned economy. Instead of directly clashing, the superpowers supported opposing sides in regions such as Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. The race for military superiority accelerated scientific progress at an unprecedented pace. Intercontinental ballistic missile technology gave birth to the space race. Humanity set foot on the moon, and satellites were launched. Much of the internet, GPS, and microchip technologies we use today are byproducts of Cold War defense projects. The need for economic and military unity among Western European countries against the Soviet threat laid the foundations of today's European Union. Europe ended centuries of internal wars and united around a common market and political structure. This initiated one of the longest periods of peace in history. The existence of nuclear weapons made total war between great powers impossible. This created a new hybrid warfare culture, where states could not openly fight each other, but instead relied on intelligence operations, cyber warfare, and economic sanctions. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the capitalist model became the dominant global economic system. As China opened up to the market economy and former Soviet states integrated into the world, globalization reached its peak. However, this also led to the weakening of local cultures and the rise of a uniform consumer society. The struggle between these two giants forced newly decolonized countries in Africa and Asia to choose a side. This led to the support of authoritarian regimes simply because they aligned with one bloc, and it laid the groundwork for regional conflicts that still persist today. This war is the most destructive, the most widespread, and the most technologically transformative event in human history. It was not just a clash of armies. It was a total war of ideologies, industries, and scientific capacities. When the war ended, the old world had died, and the modern order we live in today was born. The war was built upon the desire of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, to reshape the world, and the resistance of the Allied powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The war ended with the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, marking the moment humanity gained the power to destroy itself. Britain and France, which had dominated the world for centuries, emerged from the war economically and militarily exhausted. Two new giants took the stage, the United States and the Soviet Union. The world entered the era of the Cold War, defined by the ideological rivalry between these two powers. The Holocaust, in which the Nazis systematically murdered 6 million Jews, redefined the concept of absolute evil in human history. This tragedy accelerated the process leading to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and initiated the geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East that continue to this day. It also led to attempts to secure individual rights internationally through documents such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The needs of the war gave birth to inventions that completely transformed civilian life. Nuclear energy, modern jet engines, early computers, radar technology, and the mass production of antibiotics are all legacies of this war. With the weakening of European powers, dozens of countries from India to Africa gained independence. The number of modern nation-states rapidly increased, and colonial empires disappeared into history. This development led to the rise of the Third World concept and the Global South. According to many sources, this is the most important war in history. It was not just a military conflict, it was a massive rupture in which empires collapsed, borders were drawn with rulers, and the aristocratic world of the 19th century gave way to the modern, ideological, and chaotic 20th century. The war began with nationalism, colonial rivalry, and a complex chain of alliances, triggered by the assassination of an Austro-Hungarian heir. With machine guns and heavy artillery strengthening defense, the war became deadlocked. Soldiers died for years over the same few kilometers of mud. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, and the first use of poison gas transformed warfare from a chivalrous duel into industrial slaughter. The war was fought not only on the front lines but also in factories and kitchens. The participation of women in the workforce permanently changed social structures. The war buried 4 great empires that had ruled for centuries: the Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Russian empires. This collapse led to the establishment of dozens of new nation-states, from Poland to Czechoslovakia. However, this process also planted the seeds of ethnic conflicts and endless border disputes. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East was divided between Britain and France, with artificial borders. Many of today's crises, instabilities, and identity conflicts in the region are the legacy of these artificially drawn maps. The destruction caused by the war paved the way for the Bolshevik Revolution in Tsarist Russia in 1917. The world's first socialist state, the Soviet Union, was established. This event marked the starting point of the capitalism-communism conflict that would shape the rest of the 20th century. The United States entered the war later and shifted the balance, intervening in European affairs on a massive scale for the first time. This was the first major step in the United States' rise as a global power. Wilson's principles made the idea of self-determination a global norm. The meaninglessness and horror of the war shattered humanity's belief in progress and rationalism. Movements such as Dadaism and Surrealism emerged in art. A deep sense of disillusionment and nihilism spread throughout society. This spiritual void, combined with the harsh conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, unfortunately fueled extremist ideologies that would trigger an even greater disaster just 20 years later, World War II. As you can see, everything we consider normal today, from the words we speak to the technology in our pockets, even our very existence, is the result of decisions made on those turbulent battlefields of the past. If even one of these wars had ended differently, you might not be the person watching this video right now. You could have been the protagonist of a completely different story in a completely different geography. History is not just dusty pages. It is our collective memory, the architect of our present. As we examine these 10 great turning points, one truth becomes clear. A single decision is enough to change the fate of an entire world. So, which event do you think should absolutely be on this list? The missing piece that truly changed the world? Share in the comments the war or event that surprised you the most in your own journey through history. Let's grow this deep and inspiring discussion together. Until we meet in the next story, stay curious.